Hi, it's John again, and we're back at Roald Dahl's Mr. Twits book in my kitchen. And last time I put the book down, I started laughing, so I started crying. It's pretty funny. Okay. So now this section is called, well, you remember she went up in the sky on the balloons, right? So this is called Mrs. Twit comes ballooning down, it's called. So Mrs. Twit may have been ugly and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up there in the sky, she had a bright idea. If I can get rid of some of these balloons, she said to herself, I will stop going up, and I will stop coming down. Well, that makes sense, right? So she began biting through the strings that held the balloons in to her wrists and arms and neck and hair. And each time she bit through a string and let the balloon float away, the upward pull got less and her rate of climb slowed down. When she had bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether, and she stayed still in the air. And she bit through one more string. Very slowly she began to float downward. It was a calm day. There was no wind at all. And because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up, and now she came absolutely straight down. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. Ooh. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at the extraordinary old woman in the sky. So the next bit is called Mr. Twit Gets a Horrid Shock. Mr. Twit thought he had seen his ugly wife for the last time and was sitting in the garden celebrating with a mug of beer. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down. When she was about the height of the house or above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out at the top of her voice, Here I come, you grizzly old grunion, you rotten old turnip, you filthy frump. Mr. Twit jumped up as though he had been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer. He looked up. He gasped, and he gurgled. A few croaking sounds came out of his mouth. Whoa, he said, blah, whoop. I'll get you for this, shouted Mrs. Twit. She was floating down right on top of him. She was purple with rage and slashing the air with her long walking stick, which she had somehow managed to hang on all the time. I'll swish you to a swazzle, she shouted. I'll swash you to a swizzle. I'll garnish you up a guzzle. I'll garnosh you with a gazzle. These are that sounds pretty bad. I don't know what all these things are, but I wouldn't want that to happen to me. And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and petticoats and fury landed right on top of him, lashing out with a stick and cracking him all over his body. He's getting a severe whipping. Well, I'm thinking he deserved it, don't you? So the house, the tree, and the monkey cage is next. Well, that's enough of that. We can't go on forever watching these two disgusting people doing disgusting things to each other. We must get ahead with the story. So here's a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Twit's house in their garden. Some house, it looked like a prison, not a window anywhere. Who wants windows? Mr. Twit had said when they were building it. Who wants every Tom, Dick, and Harry peeping in to see what you're doing? It didn't occur to Mr. Twit that windows were meant mainly for looking out, not for looking into. And what do you think of the ghastly garden? Mrs. Twit was a gardener. She was very good at growing thistles and stinging needles. I always grow plenty of spiky thistles and plenty of stinging needles, she used to say. And I keep out those nasty, nosy children near the house. You can see Mr. Twit's work shed. On one side, there's a big dead tree. It never has any leaves on it, well, because it's dead. And not far from the tree, you can see the monkey's cage, and there are 4 monkeys in it. They belong to Mr. Twit, and we'll hear about them later. Hug sticky glue. Did I get that right? Not quite. Let me read it again. Hug tight sticky glue. Hug tight sticky glue. That's what it says. This doesn't sound good. Well, let's read on here. Once a week on Wednesdays, the Twits had bird pie for supper. Mr. Twit caught the birds and Mrs. Twit cooked them. Mr. Twit was good at catching birds. On the day before the bird pie day, he would put up the ladder up against the big dead tree and climb up into the branches with a bucket of glue and a paintbrush. The glue he used was called Hug Tight, and it was stickier than any other glue in the world. He would paint it along the tops of all the branches and then go away. As the sun went down, the birds would fly down from all around to roost for the night in the big dead tree. They didn't know, poor things, that the branches were all smeared with horrible Hug Tight. The moment they landed on the branch, their feet stuck, and that was that. The next morning, there was bird pie. Mr. Twit would climb the ladder again and grab all the wretched little birds that were stuck to the tree. It didn't matter what kind they were, throng thrushes, blackbirds, sparrows, crows, little jelly worms, any robins, anything. They all went into the pot for Wednesday's bird pie supper. It's quite this. The picture of this pie has lots of little feet sticking out. I don't know if it's worthwhile. You can have a quick look at that thing. That's a real bird pie. I always like to eat that with all the feet sticking out. 4 sticky little boys, the next bit's called. One Tuesday evening, after Mr. Twit had been up the ladder and smeared the tree with Hug Tight, 4 boys crept into the garden to look at the monkeys. They didn't care about the thistles and the stinging needles, and not when they were monkeys to look at. After a while, they got tired of looking at the monkeys, so they explored further into the garden, and they found the ladder leaning up against the big dead tree, and they decided to climb up onto it just for fun. This doesn't sound good. There's nothing wrong with that. So the next morning, when Mr. Twit went out to collect his birds, he found 4 miserable little boys sitting up on a tree, as tight as could be by the seats of the pants on the branches. There was no birds because the presence of the boys had scared them away. Mr. Twit was furious. As there was no birds for my pie tonight, he shouted, "Then you'll have to be it instead." He climbed up the ladder. Boy pie might be better than bird pie, he went on, grinning horribly. More meat and not so many little bones. The boys were terrified. "He's going to boil us," cried one of them. Oh, looks that way, doesn't it? "He'll stew us alive," wailed the other one. "He'll cook us with the carrots," cried the third. But the fourth little boy, who had more sense than the other boys, whispered, "Listen, I've just got an idea. We're only stuck by the seat of our pants. So quick, unbutton your pants and slip out of them and fall to the ground." Mr. Twit had reached the top of the ladder, and just as he was about to grab the nearest boy, when all of a sudden they tumbled out of the tree and ran home with their naked bottoms winking at the sun. So, the next chapter is called The Great Upside Down Monkey Circus. Now for the monkeys. 4 monkeys were in a cage in the garden were all one family. There were Muggly-Womp and his wife and their 2 small children. But what on earth were Mr. and Mrs. Twit doing with monkeys in their garden? Well, in the old days, they had both worked in a circus as monkey trainers, and they used to teach monkeys to do tricks and to dress up in human clothes and smoke pipes and, all the rest of that nonsense that they do. Today, though, they were retired, and Mr. Twit still wanted to train monkeys, and it was his dream that one day he would own the first great upside-down monkey circus in the world. I'm sure it sounds like a great hit to me. That means that monkeys had to do everything upside down. They had to dance upside down on their hands with their feet in the air. They had to play football upside down, and they had to balance on one top of the other upside down with mugglewomp at the bottom and the smallest baby monkey at the very top. They even had to eat and drink upside down. And that's not an easy thing to do, because the food and water has to go upside your throat and inside upside down. In fact, it's almost impossible. But the monkeys simply had to do it, otherwise they got nothing. All this sounds pretty silly to you and me. It sounded pretty silly to the monkeys too. They absolutely hated having to do the upside down nonsense thing day after day. And it made them giddy, standing on their head for hours at end. And sometimes the two small monkeys would faint with not so much blood going to their heads. But Mr. Twit didn't care about that. He kept on them practicing for 6 hours a day. And if they didn't do as they were told, Mrs. Twit would soon come running out with her beastly stick. Man, this is like bad business. And I think I'll stop there for the moment and we'll pick it up again.